That bike doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be left alone to die. The foreman said it out loud, and every mechanic in the shop nodded. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed, because deep down, every single one of them believed it was true. That was the moment the flatbed pulled away, the moment the silence settled in like a funeral, and the moment an old man nobody paid attention to set down his broom, walked slowly across the oil-stained floor, and said the 4 words that stopped time itself. If you've ever been told you're too old, too slow, or too forgotten to matter, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The flatbed truck came down Route 9 on a Tuesday morning in early October, and nobody at Dawson's repair garage paid it much attention at first. Flatbeds came through Blackstone Ridge all the time, broken down pickups, farm equipment, the occasional weekend warrior sports car with a seized engine and an embarrassed owner standing next to it trying to look casual. Flatbeds were Tuesday, flatbeds were ordinary. But then Danny Ruiz, the youngest mechanic on the floor, stepped outside to get some air and stopped dead in his tracks. He stared for a long moment. Then he walked back inside and said only 3 words. "You need to see this." Marcus Webb, the shop foreman, a barrel-chested man with 22 years under his belt, and the kind of slow-burning confidence that comes from never being wrong about a machine, looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding and raised an eyebrow. "See what just come outside, Marcus." Something in Danny's voice made Marcus put down his tools. Not urgency exactly, more like reverence, like the kid had just seen something he didn't have the vocabulary to describe properly. Marcus wiped his hands on a red rag, tucked it into his back pocket, and followed Danny out into the cool morning air. The flatbed was pulling into the lot, and on the back of it sat a motorcycle that did not belong to the present century. It was a 1974 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide, and even sitting still on a flatbed truck, even coated in 40 years of road dust and rust and the quiet decay of long neglect, it had a presence. That was the only word for it. Presence, like a retired prizefighter walking into a room, slower now. Heavier now, the damage written all over him, but still carrying something in the set of his shoulders that made younger men step back just slightly without quite knowing why. Marcus walked a slow circle around the truck, hands on his hips, saying nothing. The bike was enormous. The chrome was pitted, but still threw back light in unexpected places. The leather saddlebags were cracked and curling at the edges. The gas tank carried a faded custom paint job, a black eagle over a field of dark blue that had once been extraordinary, and now was ghostly like a photograph of something beautiful that had been left out in the rain too many times. The driver of the flatbed climbed down. He was a middle-aged man, heavy-set, with a Hell's Angel support patch on his vest, in the careful, formal manner of someone delivering something precious and irreplaceable. "You Marcus Webb?" he asked. "I am." "Name's Carver. I spoke to you on the phone. This is Roy Walker's bike." He paused. "Iron Horse's bike." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd heard the name. Everyone in a certain radius of Blackstone Ridge had heard the name. Roy Iron Horse Walker had been riding with the Angels since the late 60s. He was old school in the truest sense from the era before the clubs became what they became when the road was a religion and the men who rode it were genuine outlaws in the original meaning of the word men, who lived outside ordinary American life, not because they were criminals, but because the ordinary world simply could not hold them. Roy was 73 years old now. He was in hospice care at his daughter's house on the edge of town. And he had one request. "He wants to hear it run," Carver said, "just once, before he goes." He looked at Marcus with eyes that were not asking. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." Carver nodded. "Good, because I need you to also understand something else." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. 3 other shops already tried. Good shops. 2 of them have better equipment than you do. He held out the paper. This is what they found, or rather, what they couldn't find, because none of them could figure out what's wrong with it. Marcus took the paper. He unfolded it and read it. Then he read it again. "They couldn't even get it started?" Marcus asked. "Not even close. Engine turns over twice and then nothing, like something's actively preventing it from running." Carver shrugged. Roy always said that bike had a soul. Maybe he was right. Maybe it just doesn't want to run for anybody who doesn't deserve it. Marcus looked back at the motorcycle. The cool morning light fell across the chrome and the faded eagle on the tank. He was already thinking, already reaching into the catalog of his experience for something that fits, something that matched. He was a good mechanic, one of the best in this part of Virginia, if he was being honest about it. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked quietly. Carver looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back up. "Doctors say 2 weeks, maybe less." He paused. "Roy's a tough man, but he's tired. He's been waiting for this. He said he'd hold on as long as it takes." Another pause. "Don't make him hold on too long." They unloaded the bike. It took 4 men to get it off the flatbed safely. Marcus gave it a full inspection right there in the parking lot, kneeling on the asphalt, leaning in close, shining his light into dark places, running his hands along surfaces, the way a doctor presses his hands against a patient's abdomen, feeling for something wrong, feeling for the shape of the problem. Then he stood up. "All right," he said, "let's get it inside." What happened next in the days that followed was something Marcus Webb would not fully be able to explain later. He started with the obvious: fuel system. 40 years old, sitting unused for nearly 2 decades, the carbs were gummed up with varnish, the fuel lines were cracked and brittle, the petcock was seized solid. He cleaned and rebuilt everything methodically. Danny worked beside him. So did Pete Garza, the oldest active mechanic on the floor, a quiet, careful man with arthritis in his left hand that he never complained about. Day 1, they cleaned the carburetors, rebuilt the fuel lines, replaced the petcock, tested the fuel flow. Good pressure, good delivery. They tried to start it. The engine turned over twice, then nothing. Day 2, they went into the electrical system. The 40-year-old wiring was a nightmare. Original cloth-wrapped harnesses, crumbling insulation connections, oxidized down to bare metal in places. They traced every circuit, replaced what needed replacing, tested the coil, tested the points, tested the timing. They tried to start it. The engine turned over twice, then nothing. Day 3, Pete suggested the ignition timing was off. They pulled the primary cover and inspected the advanced mechanism. It was worn badly, the weights nearly frozen. They freed it up, reset the timing by hand using a timing light borrowed from the shop across the street because theirs wasn't old enough to work correctly with a points-based ignition system. They tried to start it. The engine turned over twice, then nothing. Marcus stood with his hands on his hips and stared at the motorcycle. The shop was quiet around him. It was after 6 in the evening. The other mechanics had gone home. Danny was still there, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching Marcus's face with the particular attention of a young man watching someone he respects start to doubt themselves. "What's it doing when it turns over?" Danny asked. "Getting compression, getting spark, getting fuel. Everything it needs." Marcus paused, and then just stopping, like a door slamming shut. "Like it doesn't want to run." Marcus shot Danny a look. "Machines don't want things." "I know," Danny said. "I know that." But the look on his face said something different. On the 4th day, Carver called. Roy's daughter had called him. Roy had asked about the bike. He was having a bad week. The nurses were worried. Marcus hung up the phone and stood very still for a moment. Then he walked back to the motorcycle and started all over again from scratch. This was the thing about Marcus that his men respected. He was not afraid to admit he'd missed something. Most foremen, most men honestly would rather keep pushing in the wrong direction than stop and turn around. It takes a particular kind of strength to say out loud to yourself and to the men watching you, "I missed something. Let's go back." He called a shop meeting, 5 mechanics standing around the bike. Marcus laid it out simply: "Something's wrong with this machine that we're not seeing. I want everyone to forget what they already checked. Start fresh. Assume nothing. Tell me what you see." The men went at it for 2 more days. They checked the compression in each cylinder individually. They checked the valve timing. They pulled the heads and inspected the valves themselves. They checked the oil passages. They found a dozen small problems, the kind of ordinary aging and neglect you'd expect from a machine this old, and they fixed every one of them. They tried to start it. The engine turned over twice, then nothing. On the 6th day, a Thursday, Marcus called 2 other master mechanics. He knew men from other shops, men he trusted. He described the symptoms over the phone. They offered suggestions. He tried every one. Nothing worked. By Friday morning, the word had quietly spread through the local mechanic community, the way word always spreads in small towns, through the invisible telegraph. of people who know the same people. And by Friday afternoon, two more experienced mechanics had come by on their lunch breaks just to look, just to think, just to offer whatever they had. Both of them left shaking their heads. One of them, a 30-year veteran named Bill Stokes, stood at the door of the shop before leaving and said not unkindly but honestly the way experienced men speak honestly to each other when there's nothing left to lose. "Marcus, some machines are past saving. You might need to tell Roy's family to think about what else might give him peace." Marcus said nothing. He stood with his back to Stokes, his hands resting on the motorcycle's handlebars, his head slightly bowed, like a man in prayer, or a man in defeat. From a distance, it was hard to tell the difference. "I hear you, Bill," Marcus said finally. Stokes left. The shop fell quiet. The other mechanics drifted to their own work, and Marcus stayed where he was standing over that old motorcycle, hands on the handlebars, staring at the engine like he could will it into revealing its secret through sheer force of attention. That was when he heard the broom, the soft rhythmic scratch of a push broom on concrete, moving slowly along the far wall of the shop, unhurried, methodical. The sound of a man who had done this particular task so many times that his body did it automatically while his mind went somewhere else entirely. Walter Grayson. Marcus turned to look at him. Walter was sweeping the floor along the back wall the way he did every evening, moving through the shop with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who understood that patience was not a weakness, but a discipline. He was 70 years old, had been coming to the shop 3 days a week for the last 2 years, ever since Marcus's wife, Linda, who'd gone to church with Walter's daughter, had asked Marcus to give the old man something useful to do after his wife died. "He just needs somewhere to be," Linda had said. "He needs to feel like he's contributing." So Marcus had given him a broom, and Walter had taken it without complaint or pride, and he swept floors and organized tool racks and fetched coffee and occasionally handed a wrench to whoever was reaching for one, and that was his life at Dawson's repair garage, and he seemed perfectly content with it. The younger guys were fond of him in the distracted way young men are fond of their grandfathers, warmly, sincerely, but without quite seeing him. Walter was part of the furniture. He was Tuesday morning coffee and Friday afternoon sweeping. He was the answer to, "Where did I put that half-inch socket?" and, "Brie, is there any more of that good coffee?" He was kind and quiet and completely invisible. He kept sweeping. He hadn't looked up. But Marcus was watching him now with a new attention. Because Walter had been in the shop every day this week. He had been in the shop every day the other mechanics were there working on this bike. He had been 15 feet away during every attempt to start the engine, during every diagnostic session, during every frustrated argument about what might be wrong. He had swept his floors and fetched his coffee and handed over wrenches when asked, and he had said absolutely nothing. Not one word. And Marcus Webb, who had spent 22 years reading machines, and the men who worked on them, felt something shift in his chest, an instinct he couldn't name. The same instinct that sometimes stopped his hand just before he made a mistake. The same instinct that had once made him pull a car off the lift and recheck a suspension job that had looked perfect and found a cracked ball joint that would have put the driver into a guardrail at highway speed. He crossed the shop floor. He stopped 6 feet from Walter and waited. Walter kept sweeping. 3 more strokes. 4. Then he stopped, leaning both hands on the broom handle, and looked up at Marcus with calm blue eyes that had seen a great many things and were not easily surprised by any of them. They looked at each other for a moment. "Walter," Marcus said, "have you been listening hard not to in a space this size?" Walter's voice was even and unhurried. Concrete carries sound. "So you've heard everything. The symptoms, what we've tried." "I have." Marcus took one more step toward him. "Is there something you want to say?" Walter looked past Marcus at the motorcycle. He looked at it for a long moment with an expression that Marcus would think about for a long time afterward. Not excitement, not eagerness, but something quieter and more serious. Recognition. Like a man looking at someone he has not seen in a very long time and knowing immediately exactly who they are. Then Walter looked back at Marcus. "That engine is hydraulically locked," he said. "Not fully, partially. There's oil sitting in the lower cylinder from 20 years of the ring seeping with the bike on its side stand. It turns over twice because that's how far the piston gets before it hits the fluid. Then it stops. Every time. Like a door slamming." The shop was silent. You'd know it if you pulled the spark plugs and cranked it by hand, Walter continued. Oil would come out of the plug holes. Not a lot, but enough. Marcus stared at him. Danny had come closer, drawn by the change in the air, the shift in the invisible current that runs through any room when something important is about to happen. How do you know that? Danny asked. Walter looked at the young mechanic. His expression was patient and faintly gentle, the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked a good question. Because I've seen it before, he said simply. I've seen it on bikes. This old bikes that sat for a long time in the wrong position. It's not common, but it happens. He paused. And the cure is simple. Pull the plugs, turn the engine over by hand 3 times slowly, clean out what comes out, put new plugs in. Then she'll start. Marcus stood very still. He was doing the calculation that every experienced man does in that moment, the moment when someone tells you something that sounds exactly right, that fits perfectly into the shape of the problem, and you have to decide in real time whether to trust it or question it, whether to feel humiliated that you missed it or relieved that someone found it. Marcus chose relief. Pete, he said without turning around, get me a spark plug socket and a 1/2-inch breaker bar. Pete Garza, who had been standing very still in the background, said already reaching for it. They pulled the plugs. From the front cylinder, when Marcus turned the engine over by hand, a small but unmistakable stream of dark oil wept out of the plug hole and ran down the side of the engine block. The shop went completely silent. Danny made a sound low in his throat, not quite a word, not quite a laugh, somewhere between astonishment and relief. Pete Garza said nothing. He just nodded once very slowly with the expression of a man who has just seen something he will remember for the rest of his life. Marcus straightened up. He turned to look at Walter, who was still standing with both hands resting on his broom handle, watching quietly. How long have you known? Marcus asked. Walter thought about it. Since day 2, he said. Day 2? Marcus repeated this without inflection. Then why? He stopped himself. He took a breath. Why didn't you say something sooner? And here was the answer that would stay with Marcus Webb, that he would repeat to his wife that night and to his children years later, and to anyone who would listen for the rest of his working life. Walter Grayson looked him steadily in the eyes and said without apology and without any trace of superiority, because it wasn't my place to say, I'm the man who sweeps the floors. I know what I am in this shop. A pause. But you asked me directly, and Roy Walker is running out of time. So now I'm answering. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Marcus could ever remember in that building. Then Marcus said quietly and clearly, Walter, put down the broom. Walter looked at him. I mean it, Marcus said. Put down the broom and come tell me everything you know about this motorcycle. Walter looked at the broom in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has held for a long time and is not entirely sure how to set down. Then he leaned it carefully against the wall, and he walked to the motorcycle. He didn't touch it right away. He stood before it the way a doctor stands before a patient he is about to examine, gathering himself, letting his eyes move over the entire machine before his hands went anywhere. His gaze traveled from the front forks to the rear fender, from the engine cases to the frame tubes, from the handlebars down to the primary cover. You want to know what I know about this specific motorcycle? He asked. Yes. Or what I know about machines like this in general? Both. Walter nodded. Then we're going to be here a while, he said. You might want that coffee. For the next 2 hours in the quiet of the closed shop, Walter Grayson talked about motorcycles. He talked about them the way a man talks about something he has loved for 50 years, with a specificity and a warmth that could not be performed, that could only come from a lifetime of genuine engagement. He talked about the 1974 FLA's particular engineering character, the way the shovelhead engine breathed differently from later designs, the way its oil circulation system had quirks that Harley's own engineers had quietly acknowledged in service bulletins that most mechanics never read. He talked about the mechanical tolerances of that era, tighter than people expected, more demanding than the reputation suggested, unforgiving, in very specific ways that modern mechanics trained on modern machines were not wired to anticipate. He talked about where the weaknesses were and where the strengths were, and why a machine like this, cared for properly, could outlast almost anything built in the decades that followed. Danny sat on his overturned bucket and listened with his mouth slightly open. Pete Garza stood with his arms crossed and his head tilted. nodding occasionally with the expression of a man hearing things confirmed that he'd half known, but never quite articulated. Marcus stood at the workbench making notes on a yellow legal pad, actual handwritten notes, something he hadn't done since trade school, because he recognized instinctively that what he was hearing was not available in any manual or database or online forum. It was knowledge carried by a human being, the kind of knowledge that only exists in the minds of people who were there, who worked on these machines in the years when they were new, who learned by doing and by failing and by doing again until they got it right. The kind of knowledge that disappears when those people are gone. When Walter finished, the shop was quiet again. Marcus looked at his notes. Then he looked at Walter. "Where did you learn all of this?" he asked. Walter looked at the motorcycle. "I worked on bikes like this one from 1974 to 1988. Military first, then civilian. I built custom frames for a shop in Richmond for 6 years." He paused. "I've put my hands on maybe 30 machines like this one over the years. Haven't touched one in 15 years. He looked at Marcus. "But you don't forget." "No," Marcus said, "you don't." Another silence. Marcus put down his pen. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at Walter. He looked at Danny and Pete. Then he made a decision. "Walter," he said, "I'd like you to take the lead on this restoration." Danny looked up sharply. Pete Garza went very still. Walter looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. Surprise, yes, but underneath the surprise, something more complicated, something that had been waiting a long time to be asked. "You'd have full authority over the work," Marcus said. "Whatever you need, whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. We work for you on this one." He paused. "Roy Walker is dying. His one wish is to hear this bike run before he goes. I think you might be the only person in this state who can make that happen." Another pause. "Am I wrong?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, you're not wrong." "Then will you do it?" Walter looked at the motorcycle one more time. The old eagle on the gas tank faded and ghostly. The pitted chrome, the cracked leather, the deep accumulated silence of a machine that had been still for 20 years and was being asked to wake up one final time. "I'll do it," Walter said. Danny Ruiz, 24 years old and 4 years into his career, would say later that it was the most matter-of-fact thing he ever heard someone say before doing something extraordinary. No drama, no swelling music, no speech, just 4 words, "I'll do it." And then Walter Grayson rolled up his sleeves, picked up a wrench, and went to work. The first thing Walter did was nothing. That was what Danny noticed. After Marcus handed over the lead, after the quiet moment of agreement, after everyone expected Walter to immediately dive in with tools and instructions, he did nothing. He stood in front of the motorcycle with his arms loose at his sides, and he was still. Not frozen, not hesitating. Still. The way a man is still when he is doing the most important work of all the work that happens before any hand touches anything. Danny watched him for nearly 3 minutes. He counted. Then Walter said without turning around, "Stop watching me like I'm about to fall over." Danny felt heat rise in his face. "Sorry, I know what you're doing," Walter said, not unkindly. "You're waiting to see if I know what I'm doing." Now he turned and looked at Danny directly. "That's smart. Don't apologize for being smart." He paused. "But I work better without an audience. So go make yourself useful. I need a complete parts list of everything that's been replaced in the last 6 days. Everything. I need to know what's original and what's not." Danny blinked. "That's going to take a couple hours." "Then you'd better start now." Danny went, and Walter turned back to the motorcycle and continued his silence. Marcus, watching from the office doorway, said nothing. He recognized what he was seeing. He'd seen it in the best mechanics he'd ever known, that initial stillness, that gathering of attention before the work began. It wasn't showmanship. It was the opposite of showmanship. It was a man refusing to move until he was certain he understood what he was moving toward. After another full minute, Walter reached out and put both hands flat on the gas tank. He held them there, eyes closed. Pete Garza walked by, glanced over, and then glanced at Marcus. Marcus gave a slight shake of his head. "Don't say anything. Let him work." When Walter opened his eyes, his expression had changed. Something had shifted in his face, a sharpening, focusing the look of a man who has just located the problem on a map he was reading in his head. "Marcus," he said. Marcus crossed the shop floor. "Yeah. This engine has been worked on before, not by you, before it came here. Walter's hand moved to the left side of the engine, tracing the gasket line along the primary cover. Somebody opened this up and put it back together wrong. The gasket is installed backward. It's not leaking yet, but it will. The moment this engine runs under load, it'll start weeping oil at the primary. Marcus leaned in close. He looked. He straightened up slowly. I missed that, he said. I know. Walter moved his hand to the top of the engine. And up here, the rocker box bolts on the front cylinder are two different generations. Two of them are original Harley fasteners from '74. The other two are aftermarket wrong thread pitch, over-torqued to compensate. Whoever installed them didn't know what they were doing. He looked at Marcus. Did any of your men go into the top end? No, we didn't touch the heads. Then whoever worked on this before Roy's bike stopped running did this. Years ago. Probably thought they were helping. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. They weren't. Danny came back 40 minutes later with a handwritten list, 6 pages of yellow notepad paper covered in his careful small print. He handed it to Walter, who read it without sitting down, standing at the workbench with the pages spread in front of him, reading the way some men read a map before going into unknown territory, slowly, seriously marking things in his mind. He set the list down. He picked up 3 pages and held them out to Danny. These parts here, the ones your team sourced from that supplier in Richmond. Danny looked at them. Yeah, that's the stuff we used to rebuild the carbs in the fuel system. Call them back. Return everything. Danny stared at him. Those parts are already installed. I know. Pull them out and return them anyway. Walter set the pages down. Those are reproduction parts. Close enough for most applications. Not close enough for this one. He looked at Danny steadily. This machine is 40 years old. The tolerances on a shovel head engine are specific. You put a reproduction needle jet in a carb that was built to original specs, and you're going to have a fuel delivery problem that no amount of tuning will fix. It'll run, but it'll never run right. Danny opened his mouth, closed it. I know what you're thinking, Walter said. You're thinking that's a lot of extra work for a bike that just needs to run one time. Kind of, Danny admitted. Walter looked at him, and the quality of that look was something Danny would not forget. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was the look of a man who has decided to explain something important and is choosing his words with care. Roy Walker rode this machine for over 30 years, Walter said. He knows the sound of its engine the same way you know your mother's voice. He'll know the difference between this bike running right and this bike running almost right. And a man in his last days, Walter paused. A man in his last days deserves almost nothing. He deserves the real thing. Another pause. So we're going to do this right. All the way right. Do you understand me? Danny understood him. He got on the phone. Over the next 2 days, Walter disassembled what Marcus's team had already done and started from a different beginning. Not because their work had been wrong, it hadn't been wrong, but it had been the work of men solving a puzzle without knowing the full picture, and Walter now held the full picture in his head, 40 years of accumulated understanding of this specific engine family, this specific era of motorcycle engineering, the specific personality of this specific machine. He worked slowly, deliberately, without any performance of urgency, even though urgency was real and present, and everyone in the shop felt it. Roy Walker was still alive. Roy Walker was waiting, the clock was running. But Walter moved at the pace that the work required, not at the pace that fear demanded, and somehow that steadiness made the shop feel calmer rather than more anxious, like a surgeon who speaks quietly in the operating room. Marcus gave him full floor authority the way he'd promised. When Walter asked for something, it materialized. When Walter said stop, they stopped. When Walter said the proper replacement parts had to be tracked down from specialty suppliers rather than taken off the shelf, Marcus authorized the orders without hesitation, even when Pete quietly pointed out the cost. He's right, Marcus told Pete simply. We do it his way. The original carburetor jets came from a supplier in Ohio who specialized in vintage American motorcycles. They took 36 hours to arrive. During those 36 hours, Walter worked on every other system. Not waiting, never waiting. Moving through the machine with the methodical patience of a man who understands that restoration is not linear. There is always something else. There is always the next thing. He found 6 more problems that no one had found before him. The first was a cracked primary chain tensioner hairline crack, invisible unless you removed the shoe and flexed it by hand, which nobody had done because nobody had thought to. Walter found it by feel, running his thumb along the back face of the component in the dark. How did you even, Danny started. Experience, Walter said simply. I've seen it crack in this exact spot on engines this age. I checked it because I know to check it. He set the cracked component on the workbench. Get me a replacement. The second problem was in the wiring harness, not where Marcus's team had looked, not in the main trunk line, but in a secondary ground circuit that ran under the tank and had been poorly secured in what appeared to be a much earlier repair, the wire worn through its insulation where it rubbed against a frame tube. Not a dead short, not yet, but under load, under vibration, it would eventually arc. The engine would cut out, intermittently, unpredictably, the way the worst electrical problems always present, never when you're looking for them, always when you're not. The third problem was in the brake system, which was not Marcus's concern and not part of the restoration brief. But Walter noted it anyway and told Marcus carefully and directly that the front brake was not safe. I know that's outside the scope, he said, but I'm not going to rebuild an engine and put it in a machine that could kill somebody. Marcus nodded and added it to the list. By the end of the second day under Walter's direction, Ethan Carter arrived. Ethan was not a regular at Dawson's. He was 26 years old, worked at a dealership in the next town over, and had heard about the project through the same invisible telegraph that had brought Bill Stokes and the others through earlier. He showed up at 5:30 in the afternoon after his own shop had closed, still in his work shirt with someone else's garage logo on the chest. And he stood in the doorway and looked at the motorcycle, and then looked at the old man working on it, and something in his expression was specific and unguarded. Is it true, he asked Danny, who was near the door? Is it true they gave the lead to the floor sweeper? Danny gave him a long look. His name is Walter Grayson, he said carefully. I know his name. Ethan caught himself. He looked at Walter again, who was working at the bench with complete indifference to the new arrival. I'm just asking what's going on. What's going on, Danny said, is that Walter found problems on day one that none of us found in 6 days of full diagnostic work. And he did it in about 4 minutes. He paused. So yeah, he's leading, and yeah, you should watch yourself. Ethan stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he walked in, grabbed an empty stool, sat down about 10 feet from Walter's workbench, and watched. He didn't say anything. He just watched. After about 15 minutes, Walter said without looking up from the carburetor, he was calibrating, you work on vintage bikes. Ethan blinked. Some, not a lot. We don't see many at the dealership. What's the most common mistake a modern mechanic makes on an engine this age? Ethan thought about it. He took the question seriously rather than deflecting it, which was the right choice. Over-torquing fasteners, he said finally. Modern specs are higher. People apply them to old hardware and strip threads or crack castings. Walter looked up from the carburetor. He looked at Ethan with the careful attention he'd given the motorcycle earlier, assessing, measuring, deciding. That's correct, he said. That's the most common mistake. A pause. You can stay, but I need hands, not opinions. If I ask you to do something, do it exactly the way I describe. Not your way, my way. Understood? Ethan nodded. Understood. Good. Start by finding me the torque specs for a 1974 FLH rocker box bolt pattern, not the generic shovelhead spec, the specific 1974 spec. It's different. Ethan pulled out his phone. Not from the internet, Walter said, from the factory service manual. There's a copy on that shelf behind you. Third from the left. The blue one, Ethan found the manual, a genuine factory document, spiral-bound, its pages yellowed and tabbed with handwritten notes and faded pencil, and opened it. He found the spec. He read it out. Walter nodded. Write it on the board, big enough that everybody in this shop can read it without squinting. Ethan wrote it on the board. And just like that, without ceremony or announcement, he was part of the team. The parts from Ohio arrived the following morning. Walter unpacked them himself, inspecting each component before it touched anything else, holding jets up to the light, checking needles against original specs, with calipers rejecting 2 pieces that were within tolerance but not within his tolerance, and sending Danny back to the phone to get replacements. Danny, who had been frustrated the first time, was not frustrated this time. Something had changed in him over the last 2 days. He didn't have the language for it, yet he was 24, and some things take time to find their words, but he was starting to understand that what Walter was doing was not perfectionism in the neurotic sense. It was not obsession. It was not an old man being difficult. It was love, a specific, technical, disciplined form of love for a craft. And when you saw it up close, when you watched a man apply that kind of love to a broken thing, it was impossible not to be changed by it. The carburetor went back together in Walter's hands with a precision that made Pete Garza stop what he was doing and come to watch. Walter's hands were not young hands. They had the look of hands that had worked hard for a very long time, thickened at the knuckles, scarred in 3 places, slower than they'd once been. But their knowledge was independent of their speed. They moved with certainty. Every motion was a decision, and every decision was correct. "How do you know it's right before you test it?" Ethan asked at one point. He asked it genuinely, without any edge. Walter held up the float and looked along its surface. "I don't know it the way you know 2 plus 2, he said. "I know it the way you know when a door hangs right. When you've hung enough doors, you don't need to measure anymore. Your hands tell you, He set the float in place. "That's what experience is. It's your hands knowing before your head does." That was the moment later, looking back, that Ethan would identify as the beginning of the thing that changed his life. Not a revelation exactly, more like a door opening into a room he hadn't known existed. He'd spent 3 years being proud of being fast and current and technologically fluent. He'd taken quiet satisfaction in being the mechanic who knew the newest systems, who could plug in the latest diagnostic equipment, who didn't need to look things up. He'd quietly assumed, never saying it aloud, never quite admitting it even to himself, that the older generation of mechanics, the ones who came before computers and scanners and digital torque wrenches, were impressive in a historical sense, but not in a practical one. He was beginning to understand how wrong he was. The carburetor was reinstalled. The primary case went back together with the corrected gasket, correctly oriented gasket surfaces, cleaned to bare metal, first with a razor blade and then with solvent. Walter torqued every fastener by hand with a calibrated torque wrench, calling out each value as he reached it, making Ethan write them down. Why, Ethan asked? Why write them down? Because if something goes wrong later, you have a record, Walter said. Documentation is not bureaucracy, it's memory. And memory fades. He looked at Ethan pointedly. Write it down. Ethan wrote it down. The rocker box bolts went in with the 1974 spec that Ethan had found in the manual. New fasteners, genuine Harley parts, sourced from a dealer in North Carolina who still stocked vintage hardware. The 2 aftermarket bolts that the unknown previous mechanic had installed were thrown in the trash with a quiet finality. On what was now the 10th day since the motorcycle had arrived, Walter announced that he was ready to attempt to start. The shop gathered. Marcus stood closest. Pete was to his right. Danny stood slightly behind, arms crossed, jaw tight. Ethan stood to one side with his notepad pen ready, not entirely sure what he was ready to write down, but certain he should be ready. Walter said nothing dramatic. He simply checked the petcock. Confirmed fuel flow, confirmed choke position, confirmed ignition, timing one final time with a light. He pulled from a case in the bottom of his toolbox, a timing light that was itself a vintage instrument analog from an era when such things were built to last rather than built to be replaced. He set it down. He stood at the right side of the motorcycle. He reached down and turned the engine over twice by hand through the primary. He straightened up. He looked at the motorcycle for one moment. Then he pressed the starter. The engine turned, once, twice, 3 times, and then it caught. The sound that came out of that machine was not a sound that any of them would forget. It was not just loud, though it was loud, filling the shop and bouncing off the concrete and vibrating in the chest cavity the way only a big American V-twin can. It was the quality of the sound, 40 years of mechanical history finding its voice again. A machine that had been silent for 2 decades, speaking its name into the air of a Tuesday morning in October. Danny made a sound. He couldn't help it. It came out of him involuntarily, something halfway between a laugh and something else he'd have been embarrassed to name. Pete Garza put both hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. Marcus Webb, 22 years in the trade, stood completely still and felt something move through him that he recognized with some surprise as the closest thing to awe he had felt in a very long time. Even Ethan, the skeptic, the man of modern diagnostics and current technology, felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The engine ran. It ran with the deep authoritative rumble of a machine that had been built right and restored right, the sound rolling out through the open shop door and into the October air of Blackstone Ridge, like an announcement. Walter stood beside the motorcycle and listened. His expression was not triumphant. It was intent, focused. His head was slightly tilted, the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat past the surface of the sound to what lay beneath it. The celebration lasted exactly 11 seconds. That was how long it took before Walter held up his hand. The hand went up quiet and flat, and something in the authority of that gesture stopped every reaction in the room. Danny's laugh died. Marcus's relief froze. "Kill it," Walter said. Marcus reached over and hit the kill switch. The engine stopped. Silence crashed back into the room like something physical. "What?" Danny said. "What just happened? It was running. It sounded perfect. Why did you—" "It didn't sound perfect," Walter said. His voice was completely even. "There is a sound in this engine that should not be there." Marcus stepped closer. "What sound? I didn't hear anything." "Pete, did you—" Pete shook his head slowly. He hadn't heard it either. "A tick," Walter said. "Metallic, very small, coming from the lower frame, not the engine." He turned and looked directly at Marcus, and the expression on his face made something cold move through the room. "This isn't an engine problem." He moved to the left side of the motorcycle. He crouched down slowly, one hand on the frame for balance, the other tracing along the lower frame tube with 2 fingers, moving carefully, deliberately, like a man reading something written in a language only he can see. He stopped. His hand stopped moving. And then he said 3 words in a voice so controlled that the control itself was terrifying. "Get me light." Ethan moved first. He had a pen light on his keychain, and he had it out and aimed before anyone else had processed the request. The beam cut along the frame tube right where Walter's fingers had stopped. The crack was there. It ran along the underside of the main frame tube at the lower weld junction, the point of maximum stress, the point where every bump and every load and every torque reaction concentrated itself across 40 years of hard riding. It was not a surface crack. It was not a cosmetic flaw. It was a structural fracture running deep and angry into the metal held together for now by nothing more than the memory of what it had once been. If the motorcycle ran under load with a rider aboard, that frame would fail. Not might fail, would fail. The only question was how many miles and how many minutes before it did. Marcus stared at the crack. His face had gone very still. "If Roy had ridden this," he said slowly, "he would not have made it far," Walter said. He straightened up. He looked at the crack for another moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "I need to tell you something difficult." "Tell me." "Repairing this crack correctly requires a welding technique, a specific TIG process on chromoly steel, with a preheat and post-heat protocol that is not common anymore. Most modern welders have never done it." He paused. "I have done it, but I haven't done it in 12 years, and my hands are not what they were." He looked at his hands for a moment as if consulting them. "And we have at most 3 or 4 days before Roy Walker runs out of time." The shop was silent. Everyone was looking at Walter, and Walter was looking at the cracked frame with an expression that contained in equal measure the weight of what he was being asked to do and the absolute unwavering refusal to back away from it. "Can you do it?" Marcus asked. Walter was quiet for a long time. The October light came through the open shop door. The smell of oil and metal and old leather hung in the air. "I don't know," Walter said. And he said it with such plain honesty, such complete absence of bravado or false comfort that it landed harder than any confident answer could have. Then he picked up his wrench. "But I'm going to try." Nobody moved for a full 10 seconds after Walter said those words. The wrench was in his hand, the cracked frame was in front of him, and the weight of what he'd just admitted, "I don't know," pressed down on the shop like a physical thing. Then Marcus said quietly, "What do you need?" Walter didn't answer right away. He was already inside his own head, already working through something that only he could see. His fingers moved back to the crack, tracing its length again, with 2 fingertips reading it the way a blind man reads a page. His lips moved slightly, not talking, calculating. "Time," he finally said, "and a TIG welder, not the one you have here. The Lincoln in the back corner is a MIG setup. I need TIG." He looked at Marcus. "You know anybody who has one?" Marcus pulled out his phone without a word and started making calls. Danny stood with his arms at his sides, still processing what his eyes had shown him 60 seconds ago. He'd seen the crack. He understood what it meant mechanically. But something about seeing it, about being this close to a catastrophe that had almost been invisible, made his stomach feel wrong. How did that happen? He asked. How does a frame crack like that without anybody seeing it? Walter didn't look up from the frame. Metal fatigue, he said, 40 years of stress cycles. Every pothole, every hard stop, every time this bike took a load, and all of it accumulates at the weakest point, the weld junction. He paused. And it doesn't announce itself. It waits. It grows slowly in the dark where nobody's looking, until one day it's gone far enough that it doesn't need permission anymore. He straightened up. He looked directly at Danny. That's why you check. That's why you look everywhere, not just where the problem seems to be. Danny nodded. He felt he'd just been taught something that went considerably beyond motorcycle frames. Marcus got off the phone. Dale Hutchins. He's got a TIG set up in a shop on the north side. Good equipment. He says we can use it tonight if we need to. We need to, Walter said immediately. We start tonight. Ethan spoke up from the side bay. Walter, before we get into the welding, what exactly is the protocol? You said preheat, post-heat. Can you walk me through it? I want to understand what we're dealing with. Walter looked at him. 3 days ago, he'd been a stranger with a skeptical face at the door. Now he was standing with a notepad pen ready, asking the right question in the right way. Walter noticed that. He didn't say so, but he noticed it. Chromoly steel, Walter said, is not mild steel. It's an alloy. Chrome and molybdenum. Stronger, yes, but it has a very specific response to heat. If you weld it cold, no preheat, the heat from the arc creates a thermal shock zone around the weld. The steel in that zone becomes brittle, martensitic microstructure. Looks fine, tests fine, but under stress, it can crack again faster than the original failure. He paused. The preheat brings the entire joint up to a temperature that prevents that shock. The post-heat, the slow cool down, lets the crystalline structure normalize. Another pause. Skip either step, and you might as well not weld it at all. Ethan was writing fast. What temperature? Marcus asked. 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit preheat. Controlled cool down wrapped in welding blankets. Minimum 2 hours. Walter looked at the frame. And the weld itself has to be done in specific passes. Root pass, first very low amperage, TIG with the right filler, rod, ER80S-D2, not the common ER70. It has to match the alloy. He paused. Most welders default to ER70. It's what they have on the shelf. It will not hold on this application. Where do we get ER80S-D2 tonight? Danny asked. There's a welding supply house in Charlottesville that does emergency orders, Walter said. They close at 8. It's 6:15. Somebody needs to drive right now. Danny was already reaching for his keys. Get 2 spools, Walter called after him. If I make a mistake on the first pass, I'm not stopping to drive to Charlottesville in the middle of the night. Danny was out the door. The crack in the frame meant the motorcycle had to come apart again. Walter began the disassembly with the same deliberate patience he'd brought to everything else. But there was a difference now. A new quality to his movements, a compression of efficiency that hadn't been there before. Not panic, not rush, but a recognition that the margin had shrunk. Roy Walker was 3 days from the outer edge of what his body could hold, and a motorcycle frame repair done right could not be rushed. Those two facts pulled in opposite directions, and Walter held them both steadily without letting either one win. Ethan worked beside him now without being asked. He'd stopped waiting for instructions and started anticipating needs, holding things steady when Walter needed both hands free. Reading Walter's next move from his setup and preparing the right tool before the request came. Walter noticed this too. He said nothing, but after the third time it happened, something in his posture changed very slightly. A small relaxation around the shoulders. The physical language of a man who has stopped working alone. Pete Garza watched from a stool, his arthritic hand resting in his lap, not working but not leaving. He was 61 years old and had been a mechanic for 38 years, and he understood with the clarity that comes from long experience that he was watching something rare. He'd worked beside men who were technically proficient. He'd worked beside men who were fast. He'd worked beside men who were creative. He'd never worked beside a man who was all three things simultaneously and made it look like patience. Marcus stayed in the shop too, though there was nothing for him to do. He stayed the way you stay in a hospital room, not because your presence accomplishes anything mechanical, but because leaving feels wrong. At 7:40, Danny came back from Charlottesville with 2 spools of ER80S-D, 2 filler wires slightly out of breath, and set them on the bench with the careful reverence of a man delivering something important. Walter picked up 1 spool, checked the label twice, set it down. "Good," he said. That was all. But from Walter, that single word landed like a commendation. By 9 o'clock, the frame was stripped to bare metal. No engine, no fenders, no wiring, nothing. Just the steel skeleton of the motorcycle resting on a stand under the shop lights, the crack exposed and ugly and honest. Walter crouched beside it with a wire brush and cleaned the weld area to bare bright metal, removing 40 years of paint and grime and oxidation until the steel gleamed in the light. Then he stopped and looked at Ethan. "Have you ever TIG welded?" he asked. Ethan hesitated. "Some. In school. Not chromally, not this kind of repair." "Can you hold a consistent bead on flat stock?" Another hesitation. "I think so." "Don't tell me what you think," Walter said. "Tell me what you know." Ethan looked at him steadily. "I can hold a bead on flat stock, yes." Walter nodded. "Then you're going to practice tonight. While I'm preheating the frame, you're going to run beads on scrap chromally. There's a boss of offcuts at Hutchins' shop until your hands are warm and your arc is consistent. Because when the time comes, if my hands give me trouble." He paused. He looked at his hands again, the same consulting look he'd given them earlier. "I need someone behind me who can finish what I start." The room went very quiet. Ethan understood what was being said. He felt it land in his chest with a weight that was both terrifying and, if he was honest, the most significant thing anyone had ever said to him professionally. This 70-year-old man, this undisputed master of the thing they were doing, was looking at him and saying, "I might need you. I am choosing you." "I'll be ready," Ethan said. "Good." Walter stood. "Let's go." Dale Hutchins' shop on the north side was dark from the outside, but the lights inside were on and the door was unlocked. Dale himself, a compact, weathered man in his 50s, was waiting inside with the TIG welder already set up and a propane torch and heat blankets laid out on the workbench. He looked at the stripped frame when Marcus and Walter carried it in, and he let out a low whistle. "That's a bad crack," he said. "Yes," Walter agreed. "You sure you can fix it?" Walter looked at him without any detectable offense. "No," he said pleasantly, "but I'm sure I'm going to try on." Dale blinked. Then he laughed, a short, surprised laugh, the kind that comes out when someone says something unexpected and entirely true. He stepped back and gestured at the setup. "She's all yours." Ethan went to the scrap box. He pulled out offcuts of chromoly tube, clamped them in a vise, and began running practice beads. His first bead was rough, too much heat, slightly inconsistent travel speed. He ground it off and ran another. Better. He ran 6 beads in the first 20 minutes, each one tighter than the last, until his hands stopped remembering their nervousness and started remembering their training. Meanwhile, Walter began the preheat. He moved the propane torch in slow, even circles around the crack area, bringing the heat up, gradually checking the temperature with a surface thermometer every 2 minutes. Not rushing, not guessing. 350 degrees. He checked it 3 times. When the readings were consistent, he set down the torch and sat on a stool and waited 3 minutes for the heat to equalize through the metal. Marcus watched the thermometer readings over Walter's shoulder. "It's holding," he said. "It'll hold," Walter said. "The steel wants to cooperate. We just have to give it the right conditions." He picked up the TIG torch. He adjusted the amperage on the machine lower than most welders would use, precisely calibrated to the thickness of the tube wall. He adjusted the gas flow. He sat for a moment with the torch in his hand, not starting, just holding it. His eyes were on the crack. His breathing slowed. Then he looked at his right hand. His hand was shaking. Not badly, not dramatically. A small tremor, the kind that comes with age, and the cold and the accumulated wear of 70 years lived hard. But small was enough. In TIG welding, small mattered. A tremor in the torch hand meant an inconsistent arc, and an inconsistent arc on a root pass in a structural weld meant the repair could fail under exactly the kind of stress it was designed to withstand. Walter set the torch down. He stared at his hand for a long moment, with an expression that nobody in the shop had seen on his face before. Not defeat, not fear. Something older and quieter than either of those. The look of a man reckoning honestly with a gap between what he had once been and what he was now. Marcus saw it. He said nothing. Pete Garza saw it. He said nothing. Ethan at the vise with his practice piece looked up and saw Walter staring at his own hand, and something in his chest clenched. Then Walter looked up at Ethan. "Come here," he said. Ethan set down his torch and crossed the shop floor. He stood in front of Walter. He looked at the shaking hand without pretending he hadn't seen it. "Your last practice bead," Walter said. "How did it feel?" "Solid," Ethan said. "Consistent. Better than anything I ran in school." "Show me your hand." Ethan held out his right hand. It was steady. 26 years old, well-rested, warm from the practice work. It was steady. Walter looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan's face. "I'm going to talk you through every pass," he said. "Every single one. I will not leave your side. You will do exactly what I tell you when I tell you the way I tell you. If I say stop, you stop immediately. If I say move, you move. If I say more heat, you add heat. If I say less, you reduce it." He paused. "This is not your repair. It's mine. Your hands are just going to do the part that mine can't do right now." Ethan swallowed. "Okay." "Not okay," Walter said immediately. "Yes or no, can you do this?" "Yes," Ethan said, "I can do this." Walter held his gaze for 3 full seconds, measuring, deciding. Then he nodded once with a finality that meant the decision was made and would not be revisited. "Sit down," he said. "Get comfortable. Get your arc established on a piece of scrap first. When you're ready, tell me." Ethan sat at the welding table. He pulled his helmet down. He struck an arc on scrap metal and held it for 30 seconds, feeling the rhythm return to his hands, letting the work fill him up until there was nothing in his mind except the puddle and the filler and the distance between them. He lifted his helmet. "Ready," he said. Walter pulled his stool alongside the frame. He positioned himself where he could see the crack clearly and Ethan's torch hand simultaneously. He picked up a flashlight and aimed it at the joint. He picked up the filler rod himself and held it at the ready. "Root pass," Walter said. "Starting at the 6 o'clock position on the tube. Travel up toward 9 o'clock. Amperage is set. Don't touch the machine. Gas is flowing. Strike your arc 2 inches ahead of the crack to establish temperature, then move back to the start position." He paused. "Slow, even. Let the puddle form fully before you move forward. Watch the puddle, not the arc." Ethan pulled his helmet down. He struck the arc. The blue-white light of the TIG arc lit the frame and Walter's face simultaneously. And in that light, Walter looked like something elemental, like a man who had been built specifically for this moment in this room, whose entire 70 years of living had been a long preparation for sitting on this stool next to this piece of steel, watching this young man's hands. "Good," Walter said. His voice was low and steady, calibrated to carry through the welding helmet without startling. "Good. Puddle is forming. Move forward. Slow. Feed the rod. Don't rush the rod. Let the puddle pull it in." Ethan moved forward. The weld grew. "Steady. You're pulling the arc slightly. Bring it back. There. That's it. Keep that distance. Feed the rod." Around the room, no one breathed. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, jaw set, watching Ethan's torch hand with an intensity that was almost painful. Pete Garza had his eyes closed, listening to the sound of the arc the way a musician listens to a note. Dale Hutchins stood in the doorway of his own shop like a visitor. "Good," Walter said. "Good. You're at the 9 o'clock position. Don't stop. Keep moving. Same speed, same rod angle." The bead grew around the tube. It was clean. It was consistent. It was in the unsparing technical judgment of the man watching it. Good work. When Ethan completed the root pass and lifted his helmet, his face was wet with sweat under the fluorescent lights. His hands, when he set down the torch, were shaking now, the shake of effort spent, not the shake of age. He looked at Walter. Walter was looking at the weld. He had a small flashlight aimed at the bead, and he was examining it inch by inch with the attention of a man reading a sentence that carries enormous weight. He moved the light slowly along the full length of the pass. Then he sat back. "Clean fusion," he said. "Consistent width. No porosity I can see. No undercut." He looked at Ethan. "That's a good root pass." Ethan let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding since he struck the arc. "Don't celebrate yet," Walter said immediately. That's one pass. We need 3 more. And the second pass is where most welders make their mistake. They relax after the route and they lose discipline on the fill. Don't relax. He held Ethan's eyes. Stay in it. They worked through the night. 3 more passes on the primary crack. Walter called every move, every adjustment, every rod angle and travel speed. Ethan executed. Somewhere around midnight, Marcus brought coffee that nobody touched until both hands were off the torch and the arc was cold. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, Pete Garza fell asleep on a stool in the corner and nobody woke him. After the 4th and final pass, the cap passed the cosmetic layer that sealed the repair and gave it its finished profile. Walter called a halt. He wrapped the frame carefully in welding blankets, folding them with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial, tucking the edges in, ensuring even coverage. 2 hours minimum, he said. Don't touch it, don't move it, don't even breathe on it hard. He stood up slowly from the stool, and the standing was not easy. He put one hand on the workbench and pushed himself upright, and the stiffness in his knees and back announced itself without apology. He was 70 years old, and he had been crouched over a welding table for 4 hours, and his body was charging him the appropriate price. Ethan stood beside him. He said nothing. He didn't offer a hand because he understood Walter well enough by now to know that wasn't what was wanted. He just stood nearby in case it was needed. Thank you, Walter said. He said it quietly and directly the way he said everything. Ethan looked at him. I didn't do anything you didn't tell me to do. That's exactly right, Walter said. And that's exactly what was needed. A pause. You're a good welder, better than you think you are. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then can I ask you something? You can try. Why did your hand shake? He paused. I mean, I know why. Age, tiredness, whatever. But the way you looked at it, it seemed like... He stopped searching for the right word. Walter looked at his hand. He turned it over slowly, looking at the palm and then the back. Because I remember when it didn't, he said simply. There's a particular kind of loss that comes with aging that nobody prepares you for. Not the big things, not health or money or people you love. Those losses are announced. They come with funerals and doctor visits and paperwork. He paused. The hard ones are the small losses, the tiny withdrawals. The morning you realize that your hands can't do something they used to do without thought. He closed his hand into a loose fist. I held a TIG torch for 30 years without tremor. It was as natural as breathing. Another pause. Tonight was the first time I admitted out loud that those days are behind me. The shop was very quiet. That sounds like it cost something, Ethan said. It did, Walter said. He looked at Ethan, and the expression on his face was something that only comes from having lived long enough to know the difference between loss and defeat. But Roy Walker is going to hear his motorcycle run, so tonight the cost was worth it. They drove back to Dawson's at 2 in the morning. The frame stayed at Hutchins' shop, wrapped in blankets, cooling slowly and correctly. They would retrieve it in the morning. They would inspect the weld in daylight with fresh eyes. They would know then whether the night had given them what they'd asked of it. Marcus drove. Walter sat in the passenger seat with his eyes straight ahead. Ethan was in the back. Nobody spoke for most of the drive. Then Marcus said without looking away from the road, Walter, when did you last sleep? Walter thought about it. Yesterday morning, and he said, you need to go home. Get 6 hours at least. I'll sleep when it's done. Walter, Marcus. Walter's voice was quiet but absolute. I'll sleep when it's done. Marcus drove. He didn't argue. He understood that there are certain kinds of determination that exist beyond the reach of practical concern, and that trying to redirect them is like trying to redirect a river with your hands. They reached the shop. Marcus parked. Walter got out of the truck without help, moving stiffly but steadily. He looked at the dark shop for a moment, the building where the motorcycle waited in pieces, where Roy Walker's last wish waited in pieces, where everything was suspended in the hour before completion or failure. Then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it for a moment, then answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, measured and careful, the voice of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. Mr. Grayson, my name is Angela Walker, Roy's daughter. A pause. I got your number from Mr. Webb. I'm sorry to call so late. Another pause, and in that pause was everything. The doctors came this evening. They said, her voice held just barely. They said it's going to be sooner than they thought. They're saying 2 days, maybe less. Walter stood in the parking lot with the phone at his ear and the October night around him and said nothing for a moment. "Mr. Grayson," Angela said. "Is there any chance we'll be ready?" Walter said. A small silence. "Then you can promise that." Walter looked at the dark shop. He looked at his hands. He looked at the scammery. "No," he said, "I can't promise it, but I will work until it's done or until there's nothing left of me to work with." He paused. "That's the best I have." Angela Walker was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The careful control was still there, but underneath it was something raw and real. "My father, he told me about this bike, about what it meant. He used to say it was the only machine he ever rode that felt alive." She stopped. "He said if he could just hear it one more time, he'd know that some things don't have to end." Her breath caught slightly. "Please, Mr. Grayson, please." Walter closed his eyes for just a moment. "Tell your father," he said, "that we're not done yet." He hung up. He stood there with the phone in his hand. Then he turned and looked at Marcus and Ethan, who had heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand everything. "2 days," Marcus said. "Maybe less," Walter said. The three men stood in the parking lot in the dark and the cold, and the weight of that information settled over all of them differently. Marcus felt the pressure of responsibility, a foreman's familiar burden, the weight of outcomes. Ethan felt something that was partly fear and partly the particular electric aliveness that comes from being inside a moment that matters. Walter felt neither of those things, or rather he felt both of them and held them the way he held everything steadily with both hands without letting them spill. He put his phone in his pocket. He turned to the shop. He reached for the handle. "We go back to Hutchins first thing in the morning," he said. 6 o'clock. We inspect the weld. If it's good, we reassemble." He looked at Marcus. "I need every person you trust to be here tomorrow. All hands." "Done," Marcus said. Walter opened the door. He walked into the dark shop. He didn't turn the lights on immediately. He stood in the dark for a moment, and in the dark, he could hear or felt that he could hear the ghost of the engine that had run for 11 seconds that afternoon. The sound of it, the deep authority of it, the particular voice of this particular machine speaking after 20 years of silence. He stood there in the dark, and he listened to that ghost sound, and he let it remind him what this was for. Then he turned on the lights, and he got back to work. Walter did not sleep. He told himself he would. He sat in the chair in the corner of the shop at 3 in the morning with his eyes closed and his hands resting on his knees, and he tried to let his body do what it needed to do. But sleep didn't come. What came instead was a kind of deep, alert stillness, the state his mind moved into when a problem was still unresolved, when some part of his brain refused to release its grip because it knew the work wasn't finished. He'd known that state his whole life. In the military, it had kept him alive on 2 occasions he didn't talk about. In the shop in Richmond, it had stopped him from releasing a custom frame that had looked perfect but felt wrong. He'd learned long ago not to fight it. When his mind refused to rest, it was because his mind knew something his conscious thought hadn't caught up to yet. So he sat, and he let his mind work in the dark. At 5:15, Ethan arrived. He came through the side door with 2 coffees from the gas station 2 blocks over, and he stopped when he saw Walter already sitting in the lit shop, upright, eyes open, looking at nothing. "You didn't go home," Ethan said. "No." Ethan crossed the floor and held out the coffee. Walter took it. The cup was warm in his hands, and he appreciated the warmth without commenting on it. "Did you sleep at all?" Ethan asked. "No." Ethan sat down on the workbench across from him. He didn't try to address the not sleeping. He understood enough by now to know that Walter made decisions about his own body the same way he made decisions about metal, deliberately based on information only he had full access to and not subject to outside revision. "I've been thinking about the weld," Ethan said. "So have I." The second pass, there was a section about 1 inch long near the 9 o'clock position. "I felt the rod angle shift slightly. I corrected it, but..." He stopped. Walter looked at him. "You were worried about that section?" "Yes." "How much did the angle shift?" Ethan held up his hand and demonstrated the deviation with his fingers. "Maybe 5 degrees, maybe less." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Did the puddle lose continuity when it shifted?" Ethan thought about it carefully. He went back to the moment in his memory, replaying it the way he'd replayed it 3 times already in the drive home and twice in the hour before he'd given up trying to sleep. "No," he said finally. The puddle stayed consistent. I felt the shift and I corrected it before the puddle responded. Then it's probably fine, Walter said. But we'll know in an hour. He paused. Good catch. Most welders wouldn't have noticed that at all. Ethan looked at the floor. I noticed it because you taught me to watch the puddle, not the arc. Yes, Walter said, I did. They drank their coffee in silence for a few minutes. Outside, Blackstone Ridge was still dark and quiet, the kind of profound early morning quiet that belongs entirely to people who are up before they're supposed to be people with somewhere important to be. Then Ethan said, without particularly planning to, Can I ask you something personal? You can try, Walter said. The same answer as before. Last night, when Angela Walker called, you said you'd work until there's nothing left of you to work with. Ethan paused. That wasn't just something to say, was it? Walter looked at him steadily. No. So what does that mean for you, practically? What does nothing left look like? Walter was quiet for a long time, long enough that Ethan thought maybe he'd crossed a line. Then Walter said, I had a heart procedure 18 months ago, stent placement. My cardiologist has a list of things I'm supposed to avoid. Heavy exertion is on the list. He paused. Prolonged stress is on the list. Sleep deprivation is on the list. Another pause. Roughly everything I've been doing for the past 2 weeks is on the list. The shop was absolutely silent. Ethan stared at him. Does Marcus know? No. Walter, this is not a conversation I'm having with Marcus, Walter said with a finality that closed the door cleanly. Or with you past this moment. I told you because you asked a direct question and you deserved a direct answer. He looked at Ethan with calm, clear eyes. I am not in danger. I know the difference between pushing myself and hurting myself. I've known my own body for 70 years. I'm telling you this so you understand what I mean when I say I will not stop. Not because I don't know the cost, because I've calculated the cost and I've decided it's acceptable. Ethan opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the floor and then back up. Roy Walker is dying, Walter said. And his last wish is a sound. Just a sound. Something that takes 11 seconds to give a man. His voice stayed even, but something beneath the evenness was not even at all. I have the ability to give him that. The only question is whether I'm willing to pay what it costs. He picked up his coffee cup. I'm willing. Ethan said nothing. He didn't trust his voice at that particular moment, and he was self-aware enough to know it. At 6 o'clock, Marcus arrived. Danny came 2 minutes behind him. Pete Garza, who had gone home at 1 in the morning, came in at 6:15 looking like a man who had slept 4 hours and decided that was enough. Carver, the man who had brought the motorcycle off the flatbed 2 weeks ago, showed up at 6:30 without anyone calling him, which meant somebody had called him, and nobody was admitting to it. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his support patch on his chest, and his face set in the expression of a man who has traveled through a lot of difficult country and understands how these things go. Marcus looked at Walter when he came in, taking in the coffee and the unslept eyes and the particular quality of alertness that belongs to a man who has been awake and working inside his own head all night. He looked at him for a long moment. He didn't say anything about what he saw. Instead, he said, You ready to go to Hutchins? Yes, Walter said. They drove over in Marcus's truck. Walter, Marcus, and Ethan. The frame was still wrapped in welding blankets in the exact position they'd left it. Walter unwrapped it himself, carefully folding the blankets back with the same precision he'd used to put them on. He picked up his flashlight and his magnifying loupe, and he examined the weld. Nobody spoke. Walter moved the light slowly along the length of every pass. He examined the root pass first, then the fill passes, then the cap. He spent extra time on the section Ethan had flagged the 9 o'clock position on the second pass. He held the loupe against his eye and looked at it from 3 different angles. He ran his thumbnail along the bead surface, feeling for any deviation from smoothness. Then he straightened up. It's good, he said. The word came out of Ethan before he could stop it, just his breath releasing, not even a word really. Just the sound of relief made physical. Marcus put his hand on the frame tube and gripped it. You're sure? Full fusion across all passes. No visible porosity, no cracks in the HAZ, consistent bead profile throughout. Walter looked at Marcus. The only way to be completely certain is a destructive test, which would mean cutting the tube open and examining the cross-section under magnification. We can't do that. He paused. Based on everything I can see and feel, this repair is sound. I'm confident enough to put Roy Walker's life on it. He said that last sentence without drama, as a statement of professional accountability, nothing more. But it landed in the room like something sacred. Marcus nodded. Let's get it back. The reassembly began at 7:30 in the morning, and it was the most focused work Dawson's repair garage had ever seen. Every person in that shop understood what was at stake, and the understanding organized them the way nothing else could. Have no foreman's authority, no deadline, no paycheck, just the simple, undeniable weight of a dying man's last wish, pressing on everyone in the room equally and calling out the best of each of them. Walter ran the reassembly the way he'd run everything else, methodically, without wasted motion, calling out each step before it happened, so the team moved with him rather than behind him. Ethan was his right hand, anticipating, preparing, executing the precise tasks Walter assigned him with a focus that had replaced all the casual confidence he'd walked in with a week ago. Danny was on parts sourcing, organizing, delivering, keeping the inventory honest. Pete Garza's arthritic hands couldn't do fine work anymore, but his memory was a resource, and twice during the reassembly, Walter asked him a question about a torque spec or a clearance value from the factory spec, and Pete answered from memory both times correctly, both times without hesitation. Marcus watched the clock. He watched Walter. He watched the clock again. At 9:40, Marcus's phone rang. He stepped away to answer it. When he came back, his face was different. Not worse different. The specific expression of a man who has received information that changes the shape of the day. That was Angela Walker, he said. Walter kept working. What did she say? Roy had a bad night. Marcus paused. He's asking about the bike every time he wakes up. He opens his eyes and the first thing he asks is about the bike. Walter didn't stop working. How long does she think he has? She said the hospice nurse told her this morning to call the family. Marcus let that sit for a moment. His son is flying in from Seattle. He lands at 2 this afternoon. Walter set down the component he was holding. He picked it back up. He set it in place. He torqued it to spec. He set down the wrench. All of this in sequence and all of it correct, all of it done by mind in the specific silence of a man absorbing information and making calculations. We have 6 hours, he said. Maybe less, Marcus said. Then stop talking and hand me the intake manifold. Marcus handed him the intake manifold. They worked. The engine went together the way a good engine goes together when the right hands are on it, each component finding its place cleanly, the tolerances, correct, the assembly building on itself with the satisfying logic of a thing being restored to what it was designed to be. Walter called out every torque value. Ethan confirmed and recorded every one. Danny moved through the shop like a man possessed, running parts and tools and coffee that nobody had asked for but everybody needed. At 11:15, they hit the first crisis of the morning. The primary chain, the chain that connected the engine's crankshaft to the clutch, was the original chain from 1974. It had been cleaned and inspected and declared serviceable 10 days ago during Marcus's initial work. Walter had not challenged that assessment at the time because there had been bigger problems. But now, with the engine going back together and his hands on the chain running each link through his fingers one by one, he found it. One link, tight, not seized, not enough to be obvious, not enough to show up in a visual inspection. But when he pressed the side plates of that link with his thumbs, applying lateral pressure to simulate the load of running, it moved wrong, a tiny amount. Enough. This chain is done, he said. Danny looked up from across the shop. What? This link here. Walter held up the chain, pointing with one finger. It's fatigued. Under load, it'll either seize or shed. Either way, the engine stops. He set the chain down on the workbench. We need a replacement. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence, the silence of several people simultaneously doing the same calculation and arriving at the same difficult answer. A primary chain for a 1974 Harley-Davidson FLH was not an off-the-shelf item at any dealer within 30 miles of Blackstone Ridge. I can call the supplier in Ohio, Danny said, already moving toward his phone. But overnight shipping is too slow, Walter said flatly. We don't have until tomorrow. Charlottesville, Ethan offered. Already know the answer, Danny said. I called them last week about something else. They don't stock vintage primary chains. Marcus was already on his phone. He called 2 shops in quick succession. The answer was no from both. He was dialing a third when Carver, who had been standing quietly near the door for the last 2 hours, observing everything with the stillness of a man who knew his role was to wait, spoke up. "I might know somebody," he said. Every head turned toward him. Carver pulled out his own phone. "There's an old timer up in Staunton, retired mechanic, been collecting vintage Harley parts for 30 years. He's got a warehouse nobody's ever fully inventoried." He was already dial-lying. "His name is Gerald Foss. He's 81 years old and he doesn't always answer, but—" He put the phone to his ear. The shop waited. Carver waited. Then his posture changed. "Gerald, it's Carver. Listen to me, I need a primary chain for a 74 FLH original spec right now." He listened. "I know it's a lot to ask. This is for Roy Walker Gerald. Iron Horse." He listened again, longer this time. His face was unreadable. "How fast can you get here?" He listened. "Thank you." He hung up. "He has one," Carver said. "New old stock, still in the original packaging. He says he's been holding it for 30 years for the right bike." He paused. "He's driving from Staunton right now. He'll be here in 50 minutes. Marcus looked at the ceiling briefly in the manner of a man conducting a quick, sincere private act of gratitude. Walter said, "Good. While we wait, we finish everything else we can finish." They finished everything else they could finish. The primary case was ready and waiting. The engine was fully assembled except for the primary drive. The electrical system was connected and tested. The fuel system was complete and primed. The carburetor, Walter's carburetor, built to original spec with genuine components, was installed and adjusted. Gerald Foss arrived in 48 minutes, which meant he had driven from Staunton at a speed that a man of 81 probably should not have been driving. He was small and thin with white hair and the slightly ceremonial bearing of someone who understood that what he was delivering was more than a mechanical component. He carried the chain in a paper bag, still in its original wax paper packaging, yellowed with age but sealed. He handed it to Walter. Walter opened the package. He examined the chain link by link, pressing each one, checking for stiffness, checking for wear. The chain was 40 years old and never used. It was perfect. "Thank you," Walter said, looking at Gerald Foss directly. "You kept this for the right bike." Gerald looked at him with old, intelligent eyes. "Roy Walker used to ride through Staunton every summer for 15 years, he said. He always stopped at my shop. Always. Never once drove past without stopping." He paused. "A man like that deserves a good chain." He didn't stay. He said he had to get back. He shook Walter's hand, and Walter shook his, and then the old man was gone back in his truck and down Route 9, having driven 40 miles in each direction to deliver 40 years of waiting to the right moment. The primary chain went in at 12:50 in the afternoon. Walter installed it himself, adjusting the tension by feel, and then checking it twice with a deflection gauge. He set the primary cover in place. He torqued the fasteners in sequence. Then he stood up. "It is done," he said. The shop went completely still. Marcus looked at him. The whole machine. Walter looked at the motorcycle fully assembled. Now every system correct, every component in its proper relationship with every other component, a machine rebuilt from a skeleton into something whole. "It's ready." Danny said something under his breath that was too quiet to catch, but whose tone was unmistakable. Pete Garza sat down heavily on his stool, not from weakness, but from the particular feeling of completion that sometimes requires a person to sit down. Ethan stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the motorcycle and felt something move through him that he didn't have a word for. Not pride exactly, because the pride wasn't his. He'd been a hand and an instrument in service of something larger. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something more whole than either of those things. The feeling of having been present for something that mattered. "Let's start it," Marcus said. Walter held up one hand, not urgently, calmly. "One more thing." He picked up a small flashlight. He went around the motorcycle one complete time, slowly, carefully looking at every junction and connection and fastener and surface. He checked the same things he checked during assembly. Not because he didn't trust the assembly, because he was Walter Grayson, and there was a man in a hospice bed waiting for this moment, and one final check was not optional. He completed the circuit. He clicked off the flashlight. He looked at the motorcycle for one last moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Now," he said, "start it." Marcus stepped to the right side of the machine. He confirmed the petcock was open. He confirmed the choke position. He turned the key. He pressed the starter button. The engine turned. Once, twice. On the third revolution, it caught. The sound that came out of the motorcycle was enormous and correct and alive in a way that nothing manufactured could fully account for. A deep rolling thunder that started in the cylinders and traveled through the frame and the floor and the walls and into the chest of every person in the room. It was the sound of the machine being fully itself, completely right, running the way it was built to run after 20 years of silence and 2 weeks of the most demanding restoration any of them had ever been part of. The shop erupted. Danny shouted. He actually shouted a wordless, full-throated sound of pure release that bounced off the concrete and the metal walls and came back at everyone. Pete Garza stood up from his stool and clapped, and his arthritic left hand didn't stop him, and he didn't stop himself. Carver near the door put both hands over his face for a moment and then took them away, and his eyes were red at the edges in a way he didn't try to hide. Even Dale Hutchins, who had driven over from his shop when word got to him, somehow made a sound. Marcus Webb, 22 years in the trade, stood with both hands pressed flat against the gas tank, against the faded eagle, against the dark blue field, and closed his eyes and felt the vibration of the engine move through his palms and up his arms and into him like something he'd needed to feel for a very long time. Walter stood to the side. He stood with his arms at his sides and listened. His head was slightly tilted, the same listening posture he'd held on the very first day, but different now. The first time he'd been listening for what was wrong. This time he was listening for what was right. He listened for 30 full seconds. The engine was running at idle, warming up, its temperature stabilizing. The sound was consistent, deep, authoritative. The specific voice of this specific machine running correctly, running, completely running the way it had run for 30 years under Roy Walker's hands, for the silence took it. There was no tick. There was no metallic hesitation, no missed beat, no ghost of the problems that had stopped every other mechanic who had touched it. There was only the engine running right the way Walter had intended it to run from the moment he'd picked up his first wrench 2 weeks ago. He let himself hear it for 30 seconds. He allowed himself that much. Then he crossed the shop and reached past Marcus and hit the kill switch. The engine stopped. The sudden silence was almost as powerful as the sound had been. Everyone looked at Walter. "Why buy him?" Danny said. "Why stop it?" "Because the first time Roy Walker hears it," Walter said, "should be the first time it runs for him." He looked at Danny steadily. "Not the 5th or 6th time it's run in a shop. The first time he hears his motorcycle is when it should sound exactly like that." He paused. "So we don't run it again until it's in front of him." Nobody argued. Marcus looked at Carver. "Can we transport it today?" "I'll call Angela right now," Carver said, and had his phone out before he'd finished the sentence. While Carver stepped outside to make the call, Marcus turned to Walter. He looked at him carefully, the way he'd been looking at him for the past 2 weeks, with the attention of a man who was still catching up to what he was seeing. "Walter," he said, "Marcus, I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without stopping me." Walter looked at him. He made a small gesture of permission. Marcus took a breath. "I have been a mechanic for 22 years. I have worked with good men, men who knew their trade, men I respected and learned from." He stopped for a moment, organizing what he wanted to say. "I have never watched anyone work the way I watched you work this week. Not the skill, though the skill is something I'm going to spend the next 10 years trying to understand. I mean He stopped again. He wasn't a man who usually struggled for words, and the struggling was itself a form of tribute. The way you hold the work, the way it matters to you, the way you didn't stop, not once, not when your hands shook, not when the clock ran out, not when I wanted to quit, and you never once let me see you want to quit." He paused. "I am grateful to you. This shop is grateful to you. And Roy Walker," his voice shifted slightly on the name, "Roy Walker is going to be grateful to you even if he never knows your name." Walter was quiet for a moment. "He won't know my name," Walter said. "That's fine." He looked at the motorcycle. "I didn't do this for my name." "I know that," Marcus said. "That's exactly what I mean." Carver came back in. "Angela says bring it now." Roy's son landed early. There was a connection that came through faster than expected. "The whole family is there." He paused. "She said he had a good hour this morning. He was awake and talking, but..." He looked at the floor for a moment. "She said he keeps asking if it's ready every time he wakes up, like he's checking." Walter nodded once. Then we don't make him wait anymore. Getting the motorcycle onto the flatbed took 20 minutes. Walter supervised every inch of the loading, making sure the bike was secured correctly, making sure the tie-downs didn't put pressure on any surface that could mark the chrome, making sure it was balanced and stable. Even now, even with Roy Walker waiting, he did not rush what the work required. When it was loaded, Walter stood on the parking lot and looked at the bike on the flatbed for a moment. Then Ethan was beside him. "You're going?" Ethan asked. "I'm going," Walter said. "I want to come." Walter looked at him. "Why?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "Because I need to see it," he said. "I need to see his face when he hears it. I need that to be the end of this for me." Walter understood that. He nodded. They all went. Marcus drove his truck. Carver drove the flatbed. Danny rode with Marcus. Pete Garza came in his own car, driving carefully, his arthritic hand resting on the wheel with the careful patience of a man who had decided that discomfort was not a reason to miss something important. The drive to Roy Walker's daughter's house on the edge of Blackstone Ridge took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of road, and on the flatbed in front of them, the motorcycle rode like something ceremonial, like something being carried to the moment it was built for. Marcus drove and said nothing. Danny beside him looked out the window at the October light on the Virginia trees, the way the color had come into the leaves, the particular quality of afternoon light in that season that makes everything look like a memory, even while you're inside it. In the truck bed, Walter sat with his hands on his knees. His eyes were straight ahead. His expression was the same expression it had always been: calm, present, contained. But his hands resting on his knees were not entirely still. Ethan, sitting beside him, did not mention it. They turned onto the long gravel drive. The house was a two-story farmhouse, well-maintained, with a wide front yard and an attached garage. There were cars parked everywhere, family cars from the look of them, the particular clustering of vehicles that gathers at a house where something is ending. 3 men in their 40s and 50s stood near the garage, and even from a distance their bearing announced who they were. Not family, brothers, not blood brothers, the other kind. 2 of them had patches. One of them had hair that was fully white and hands like engineering tools, and the careful, watchful eyes of a man who has survived things that don't get talked about at dinner tables. He looked at the flatbed when it turned in, and something moved across his face that was not a small thing. Angela Walker met them in the driveway. She was 45 tall, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and she had the specific exhaustion of a person who had been holding everything together for a very long time and was holding it together still by a force of will that was extraordinary and quiet. She looked at Walter when he climbed out of the truck. She had never met him before. She had only a voice on the phone in the middle of the night, a voice that said, "I will work until there's nothing left of me to work with." She looked at him, this 70-year-old man in worn work clothes with oil on his hands and 36 hours of no sleep in his eyes, and she said, "Mr. Grayson." "Mrs. Walker," he said. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she said very simply, "Thank you for keeping your word." Walter nodded. "How is he?" "He's awake," she said. "He had a bad morning, but he knows today is the day. He's been telling everyone it was going to be today." She paused. "He said he could feel it." Her voice held completely. "The hospital bed is in the front room near the window. We can open the garage and he'll be able to see the bike." She looked at the flatbed. "And he'll be able to hear it." "That's all we need," Walter said. He turned to Marcus. "Unload it carefully. Roll it into the garage by hand, no engine. Position it where she can see it from inside." He paused. "I'll go in and talk to him first." Marcus blinked. "You want to go in?" "Yes." "Walter, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to, Walter said. He looked at Marcus steadily. "But there's something I want to tell him before we start it. Something he deserves to know." Angela Walker was already moving toward the front door. Walter followed her, and Ethan, standing in the gravel driveway watching Walter walk toward that house, felt something he would carry for the rest of his professional life. The sight of that old man in his work clothes with his cane and his unslept eyes and his oil-stained hands walking toward a dying man's room, with the straightforward confidence of someone who has given everything they had and knows that it was enough. The front room was quiet and warm. Roy Walker was in the hospital bed near the window, exactly as Angela had described. He was a large man, diminished, not erased, not defeated, but moved into a smaller space by the illness, the way a fire moves into a smaller fire toward the end without losing its essential quality of being fire. His hair was fully white. His hands on the blanket were large and scarred and mapped with the particular history of a life lived physically. His eyes, when they opened as Walter entered the room, were gray and clear and completely alert. He looked at Walter. He looked at the work clothes and the oil-stained hands and the cane. "You're the one who fixed my bike," he said. His voice was rough but direct. "Yes," Walter said. Roy studied him for a long moment. "Mechanic's been working on that bike for 2 weeks. How old are you?" 70. Roy made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Good Lord," he paused. "What branch?" Walter looked at him. "Army, 2 tours. You Marines," Roy said. 68 and 69. They looked at each other, these two old men, and in that look passed something that required no translation, that was entirely legible to anyone who had ever served and entirely opaque to anyone who hadn't. "I wanted to tell you something before we started," Walter said. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. Angela had quietly placed it there and quietly left the room. "I want you to know that this machine was built right. Whatever I found wrong with it, I fixed it right. The frame is repaired. The engine is correct. The carburetor is to original spec. Every fastener is at the right torque." He paused. "I'm telling you this because you spent 30 years trusting your life to this machine, and you should know that it's worthy of that trust." He paused again. "It's the same bike it was when you first rode it." Roy Walker looked at him for a long moment. "You rebuilt the frame," he said. "Cracked at the lower weld junction. Structural failure. I repaired it with the correct technique and materials." Roy was quiet. "Nobody told me about a cracked frame." "Nobody else found it," Walter said simply. Roy looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Walter wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then Roy said very quietly, "I used to ride that bike 100 miles without stopping. Just to ride, just because the road was there." He paused. "You ever do that, just ride because the road is there?" "I drove," Walter said, "never rode, but yes, I understand the feeling." "You understand the feeling," Roy repeated. He turned his head and looked at Walter with those gray, clear eyes. "What's your name, your real name?" "Walter Grayson." "Walter." Roy said the name as if placing it somewhere. "Walter. I've had men do things for me my whole life, a lot of men. Good men." He stopped. His breathing was careful and deliberate. "But I don't think anybody ever did something for me the way you did this." He stopped again. "I don't know how to say thank you for this." "You don't need to," Walter said. "Just listen to it when it runs." Roy looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, "Go start my bike, Walter." Walter stood up from the chair. He looked at Roy Walker one final time. This old rider, this tired man, this person who had spent his life in full motion and was now still waiting for one last moment of the life he'd built. He looked at him the way you look at something you want to remember completely. Then he went outside. The garage was open. The motorcycle was positioned inside it where Roy could see it from the window. The family was gathered at a respectful distance, Angela and her brother who had flown from Seattle, the 3 men with the patches standing apart, a handful of others who had come to be present at whatever this afternoon was going to be. Walter crossed the gravel driveway. He reached the motorcycle. He looked at it one final time, the faded eagle on the tank, the pistotted chrome throwing back the October light, the machine that had survived 40 years and nearly survived being saved. He confirmed the petcock. He confirmed the choke. He turned the key. He looked through the window. Roy Walker's eyes were on the motorcycle. He was watching. He was present. His large scarred hands were resting on the blanket, and his gray eyes were open and clear, and aimed at his machine with an expression of absolute uncomplicated recognition, like looking at someone you love after a very long time apart. Walter pressed the starter button. The engine turned over once, twice, and on the 3rd revolution, the 1974 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide found its voice. The sound rolled out of the garage and across the yard and into the October afternoon like something that had been waiting 20 years for permission to exist. Deep and authoritative and entirely correct, the engine running at idle, warming up the sound building on itself until it was fully present and fully right. Ethan, standing 15 feet away, heard Danny make the same involuntary sound he'd made in the shop, that half laugh, half something else. He heard one of the patched riders say something low and reverent that the engine sound covered. He heard dimly through the window a sound from inside the house that might have been Angela Walker. He looked through the window. Roy Walker's eyes were closed. And on the face of that large, diminished, entirely exhausted man, there was a smile that was not a small thing. It was not the polite smile of someone receiving a kindness. It was the full, wide, unguarded smile of a man who has just been handed back something he thought was gone forever. Something that was his, that had always been his, that no amount of illness or time or stillness could finally take. The sound of his machine, his road, his life at its most alive, all of it arriving through the October air and finding him exactly where he was. His lips moved. From outside, no one could hear what he said. But his daughter, who was holding his hand, heard it. He said the motorcycle's nickname. Just once. Very quietly. He said it the way you say the name of someone you love when you see them after a very long time. Walter stood beside the running motorcycle with one hand resting on the handlebars. He was looking at Roy through the window. His face was the same as it had always been, calm, present, contained. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Some tension that had been there for 2 weeks that had perhaps been there for longer than 2 weeks had released. Like a door that has been held closed for a long time, finally being let to rest. He stood there and let the engine run. He let it run because Roy Walker was listening. The engine ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Walter knew because he counted. Not obsessively, not the way a man counts when he is anxious, but the way a man counts when he wants to hold a moment precisely when he understands that this particular stretch of time will not come again, and he wants to know exactly how much of it there was. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of the 1974 FLH running, correctly running, completely running the way it was built to run. Then Walter reached down and turned the key and the engine quieted and the October afternoon settled back into its ordinary sounds. Wind in the trees, a car on the distant road, the particular silence that follows something extraordinary. He stood with his hand on the key for a moment. Then Angela Walker was in the doorway of the house, and she was not trying to hold anything together anymore. She stood in the doorway with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and her eyes full, and she looked at Walter across the yard with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Just the raw, unguarded face of a daughter who had just watched her father receive something she couldn't have given him herself. Walter crossed the yard to her. "He's asking for you," she said. Walter stopped. "For me? He wants to talk to you." She stepped aside from the doorway. "Please." Walter went inside. Roy was more awake than he'd been before the engine ran. That was the first thing Walter noticed. The color was slightly different in his face. Something had returned that had been absent, some quality of presence that the sound had called back, the way a familiar song calls back a specific year of your life. His gray eyes were bright and focused and aimed at Walter the moment he came through the door. "Sit down," Roy said. Walter sat. "How long did it run?" Roy asked. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Roy looked at him. "You counted?" "Yes." Roy was quiet for a moment. His large hands moved on the blanket, not restlessly, not in pain, but the way hands move when a person is working through something they want to say correctly. "I want to ask you something," he said finally, "and I need you to answer me straight. I will. Did you know when you said you'd fix it? Did you know you could?" Walter looked at him. He gave the question the honest consideration it deserved. "No," he said. "I knew I'd worked on machines like it. I knew I understood things about it that the other men didn't, but I didn't know." He paused. "I knew I had to try. Those are different things." Roy held his gaze for a long moment. "Yeah," he said softly. "They are." He looked at the ceiling. "Most men, when they don't know, they don't try. They find a reason why it's not their problem." He looked back at Walter. "Why was it your problem?" The question sat in the room. Walter thought about it the way he thought about everything carefully without rushing toward an easy answer. "Because nobody else was going to do it right," he said, "and right was what you deserved." He paused, and because he stopped, he started again. "I spent 2 years sweeping floors in that shop, handing over wrenches, fetching coffee, because that was the place I'd been given and I accepted it." His voice was even, but something underneath it was not entirely even. "But I knew what I knew. I'd always known what I knew. I just stopped being asked." He looked at his hands. "When Marcus asked me directly, it was the first time in a very long time that someone looked at me and needed what I actually had." He paused. "That matters. When you're my age, that matters more than I can tell you." Roy Walker was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before, roughened by something more than illness. I know what that feels like, he said. Being what you are and having nobody see it. He stopped. The road always saw me. That's why I rode. Out there didn't matter how old you were or what you'd done before. The machine didn't care. The road didn't care. You were exactly what you were, and it was enough. He paused. I've been lying here for 3 months, thinking I'd never hear that engine again. Thinking that part of my life, the real part, the part where I was most myself, was just over. Gone. And there was nothing I could do about it. His gray eyes found Walter's face. You gave it back to me. You understand not the machine, the feeling, the part of me that belonged to that sound. His breath caught slightly. You gave me back the part of myself I thought was already gone. Walter said nothing. He sat with those words and he let them be what they were. I want to give you something, Roy said. He lifted one hand from the blanket and gestured toward the nightstand. Open that drawer. Walter opened the drawer. Inside was a folded piece of paper and beneath it, a photograph face down. He picked up both items and looked at Roy. The paper first, Roy said. Walter unfolded it. It was handwritten, a strong hand, though the writing had the slight tremor of recent weeks in it. He read it. He read it twice. It was a letter, addressed to no one in particular and to everyone. It described in plain and specific language the restoration of Roy Walker's 1974 FLH Electroglide, and it named Walter Grayson as the man who had accomplished what no one else could accomplish, and it described what Walter had done in terms that were both technically accurate and deeply simply human. It said this man did not have to do this. He was the man who swept the floors. He chose to be more than the place he'd been given. He gave me back something I cannot name, and I will carry it out of this life with me. Walter set the letter down carefully on his knee. I wrote that 3 days ago, Roy said, when Carver told me you were still working, when he told me about the frame. He paused. I wrote it because I needed there to be a record. I needed someone to write down what you did so that when you're gone and I'm gone, it doesn't just disappear. He paused again. Now look at the photograph. Walter turned it over. It was a photograph of Roy Walker on the motorcycle. Young, maybe 30, maybe 35. The eagle on the gas tank was bright and new. The chrome was blinding, and Roy was sitting on the machine in what appeared to be a long stretch of open American highway with nothing on either side for miles. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the road ahead, and his face had an expression that Walter recognized immediately, the way you recognize something you've seen only once, but never forgot the expression of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing with nothing between him and the horizon. That's mine, Walter said quietly. He didn't mean the photograph. He meant the expression on the man's face. I know it is, Roy said. Keep the photograph. Keep the letter. A pause. Show people what this was. Don't let it be a private thing. Walter looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he folded it carefully and placed it with the letter and put both of them in the breast pocket of his work shirt close against his chest. I will, he said. He stood. He looked at Roy one final time. Roy's eyes were closing now, the good hours spending itself, the body calling in what it was owed. But his face was at rest in a way it had not been when Walter first entered the room. The particular tension of a man waiting for something that was gone. It had been answered. Get some rest, Walter said. Walter. Roy's eyes opened one more time. Don't go back to sweeping floors. Walter looked at him. You hear me, Roy said. His voice was fading but direct. Don't let them put you back behind a broom. You're too good for that, and you know it. A breath. Promise me. Walter stood for a long moment. He looked at Roy Walker, this man he had known for 20 minutes and would know for the rest of his life. I promise, he said. Roy closed his eyes. Walter walked out of the room. In the hallway, he passed Angela Walker. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made her stop. Are you all right? She asked. Yes, Walter said. Then more honestly, I will be. He walked out the front door and into the October afternoon. The yard was quieter now. Some of the family had gone inside. Some of the patched riders had moved to the driveway and stood in a loose cluster, talking quietly among themselves. The flatbed was parked at the far edge of the gravel. The motorcycle was still in the garage, resting in the particular stillness of a machine that has done what it was asked to do. Marcus was waiting on the front steps. He stood when he saw Walter and looked at his face with the careful attention he'd been giving him for 2 weeks. "How is he?" Marcus asked. "Peaceful," Walter said. He paused. "He asked me not to go back to sweeping floors." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "I was going to get to that," he said. "I was going to get to that today." He paused. "I want you to come back to the shop, not with a broom. I want you to come back as a master technician, vintage and classic restoration. You'd have your own bench, your own hours, full authority over the work you take on." He stopped. "I should have said this 2 years ago when I handed you that broom. That was my failure. I'm correcting it now." Walter was quiet. "I know what you're going to say," Marcus said. "You are going to say you don't need the title. You don't need the recognition." "I wasn't going to say that," Walter said. Marcus blinked. "I was going to say yes," Walter said. Something in Marcus's face changed a release. A relief, the expression of a man who has been carrying a debt he'd finally been allowed to pay. He put out his hand. Walter took it. They shook the way 2 men shake hands when the handshake means considerably more than a handshake. Ethan had been standing nearby, slightly removed, giving the conversation its space. When Walter turned and saw him, Ethan was looking at him with the expression of someone who has something to say and is trying to figure out how to say it. "Go ahead," Walter said. Ethan took a breath. "I want to learn from you," he said, "not casually, not as a sometimes thing. I want to come to the shop and I want you to teach me what you know. The real things, the things that aren't in any manual." He paused. "I've been a mechanic for 3 years and I thought I was pretty good. And I was watching you this week and I realized I know about 10% of what I thought I knew." Another pause. "I don't want to be that guy who knows 10% his whole life." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he said with the particular directness that was simply his nature, "You're already a better mechanic than you were a week ago. You know that." "Because of you," Ethan said. "Because of you," Walter corrected. "I gave you information. You did something with it. Those are different contributions." He paused. "But yes, come to the shop. We'll work." Ethan nodded. Something settled in his face, a decision made, a direction found. He was 26 years old and he had just chosen the next decade of his professional life in a gravel driveway in October, which was exactly the right place for that kind of decision. 3 days later, Roy Iron Horse Walker passed away. He went quietly in the early morning in the room near the window. Angela was with him. His son was there. He had not had another bad night after the afternoon the motorcycle ran, had slept better. Angela told Marcus on the phone than he had in weeks. As if something that had been keeping him awake, some unfinished business at the edge of his sleep, had finally been completed and released him. Marcus called Walter with the news. Walter received it standing in his kitchen with his morning coffee in his hand. He stood still for a moment. He set down the coffee. He went to the kitchen table where Roy's letter and Roy's photograph were sitting in a small wooden box. He'd placed them in the same night he'd come home. He opened the box. He looked at the photograph, young Roy on the open road face, aimed at the horizon exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed the box carefully. He got dressed. He drove to Dawson's repair garage. He walked in through the side door. He went to his bench now, the one Marcus had cleared, and set up with his tools organized exactly the way Walter would have organized them. He stood at the bench for a moment and ran his hand along the edge of it. Then Ethan came in. He came through the same door, work shirt on, coffee in hand, 6:30 in the morning, exactly on time. He stopped when he saw Walter already there. He looked at his face. "You heard," Ethan said. "This morning," Walter said. Ethan set down his coffee. He didn't offer condolences in the formal sense because somehow he understood that wasn't the right shape for this. Instead, he said, "Are you okay to work today?" Walter looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I'm okay to work." He paused. "There's a 1968 Triumph Bonneville on the schedule for Thursday. I want to start the assessment today. Pull the file." Ethan pulled the file. They went to work. The shop filled up around them as the morning went on. Danny arriving with his usual energy, Pete coming in and taking his stool, Marcus moving through with the particular authority of a man whose shop had been changed and who had accepted the change completely. It was an ordinary morning at Dawson's repair garage, which it was, except that it was not ordinary at all, and everyone present knew it. At some point in the late morning, without planning it, Danny walked past Walter's bench and stopped. He looked at Walter, who was deep in the assessment of the Triumph with his flashlight and his loop and his absolute characteristic focus. "Walter," Danny said. Walter looked up. Danny opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. "I just want you to know," he said, "that what you did, I'm going to remember it. I'm going to tell people about it." He paused. "I know that's not why you did it, but I'm going to tell people anyway." Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he said simply and completely, "Good." Danny went back to his work. Walter went back to his. Pete Garza, sitting on this stool nearby, heard all of this without looking up from the parts he was organizing. He organized the parts carefully the way he always did, his arthritic hand working slowly and correctly, and on his face was the expression of a man who has witnessed something he wanted to witness for a long time and has finally been given the chance. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The shop said it for him, the sound of tools and work and people doing what they knew how to do, the particular music of a place where skill is respected and effort is real, and something that was broken has been made right. Marcus was in the office when Carver called that afternoon. Carver called to say the club was going to keep Roy's motorcycle. Angela had offered to let them have it, understanding that it belonged to something larger than a family garage, to a history, to a community, to the particular kind of memory that a machine carries when it has been ridden hard and loved well. Carver said they were going to restore the chrome properly and keep the original paint and display it at the chapter house where Roy had attended meetings for 40 years. And he said, his voice shifting slightly on this, that they were going to put a small plaque on the wall beside it. Marcus asked what the plaque would say. Carver read it to him. Marcus sat with it for a moment. Then he walked out to the shop floor and across to Walter's bench, and he read it aloud quietly so only Walter could hear. The plaque read, "This machine was restored by Walter Grayson, veteran master fabricator, and the man who remembered what others had forgotten. He gave Iron Horse his last ride. He gave the rest of us a reason to remember that experience never retires, it only waits to be asked." Walter listened to the whole thing without stopping his work. When Marcus finished reading, Walter set down his tool. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Triumph's engine with the same focused attention he gave everything. Then he picked his tool back up. "That's good," he said. "That's a good plaque." And he went back to work. Because that was who Walter Grayson was. The man who showed up, who did the work correctly, who gave what he had without negotiating over the cost, and who, when it was done, went back to the bench and found the next thing that needed doing. Not because he lacked the capacity for pride or for rest or for the ordinary human pleasure of being seen and thanked and celebrated, but because the work was the thing. The work had always been the thing. The work was where he was most himself, most present, most completely who he had spent 70 years becoming. Roy Walker rode the open road because the road was where he was most himself. Walter Grayson picked up a wrench for the same reason. And in the end, those two men, the rider and the builder, the man who lived at full speed and the man who worked in patient silence, had found each other at exactly the right moment and given each other exactly what they needed. And the sound of that engine running on an October afternoon in Blackstone Ridge was the proof that some things done right and done with love do not end. They echo.